Hello everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today for Little Lunches Online. It's very exciting to have you here, and I appreciate you joining us. We're going to be talking about deaf culture, deaf space and access to the arts, and I've invited Irene Hollop here today to join us in conversation. She'll be talking about the Flow Festival, but the first thing I wanted to focus on was inclusiveness, in particular for deaf people who want to access the arts. I am Riona, and I wear many hats in the creative industries. Today I'm wearing primarily the Riona hat. I'm wearing my favourite colour, which is purple, and I'm an independent artist. I wear 3 or 4 different hats. So I've introduced the Riona hat. The other one is representing accessible arts. I'd like to acknowledge them for supporting deaf arts. The other hat I wear is that of a director of the operations manager for Flow Festival, which we will talk about later with Irene. And then lastly, the social events coordinator for the Australian Deaf Games, which is a massive responsibility, ensuring that the calendar of the social calendar rather, or social and cultural calendar of the Australian Deaf Games is completely accessible to all who participate. So back to my Riona hat. In this current climate of COVID-19, it has had serious impacts on the creative industries. And so with a lot of us enduring self-isolation or quarantine, it is a struggle. But the struggle is especially real for those of us who cannot access culture, whether it's movies or podcasts or vlogs or any other resources that rely on the ear or audio. So it really does have significant impacts on our experience in accessing the arts and also our mental health. We are unable to just log on to any performance that has transformed to online during this current climate. We are unable to join just any webinar, and it has been increasingly frustrating and caused quite a lot of stress. But I'm really thankful to Little Lunches Online and Arts Front and Feral Arts for creating not just this concept, but making them completely inclusive by providing Auslan interpreters and captioning. I'm incredibly grateful because now I still am able to feel connected to the creative industries and my colleagues across Australia. So that's a positive, but there are so many other organisations that I feel excluded from. And I'm tired of having to contact each organisation and ask if they could make their forums accessible. You know, at least in the form of captioning, because it's part of our professional development. It contributes to our work and our practice and our mental health. So I am completely grateful. To those who have obliged, it creates greater awareness of inclusivity, absolutely. And I'm worried that once we, you know, endure this long road back and we come out through the other side after COVID-19, are organisations still going to commit to access? I would love to see that continue. I'd love to see this commitment to good work and inclusivity continue, inclusivity and access for the deaf community. And you know, there are differences between captioning and Auslan interpreting. People prefer to access one or the other, sometimes both. We have a very rich culture and a very rich community, and we are very keen to share it, not just access your world, but for you to access ours. So really at the end of the day, we're all human, we're all the same, regardless of our deafness or disability or where we're from. And today I really want to look at the deaf identity. Now, you know, you can spell deafness, deaf as you would spell it, D-E-A-F. Some deaf people spell deaf always with a capital D because it's really about an identity. it's really worthwhile thinking about how we perceive ourselves and how we feel. And in us supporting the creative industries, we would like for you to support our beautiful culture and our contribution to the arts. With Irene, I have been working with her for quite a while. We met approximately 2 years ago at the Flow Festival. I flew into Melbourne from Sydney just to check it out, and it was so inspiring, and to be in a completely deaf space. And if you're not sure what that means, it means a completely deaf-led and a deaf-led event. And I didn't feel like I had to be worried about access. Everything was accessible. And I will ask Irene to talk more about the Flow Festival, what it means for deaf people and deaf artists. So I think that's a nice time to introduce Irene, the director of Flow Festival. Over to you. Thanks for joining us, Irene. Hello, everybody. This is Irene speaking. Hello. Thank you so much for inviting me along to today's session. My name, as Riona mentioned, is Irene Hollab, and I'm very excited to be part of this today. I'd also like to thank Feral Arts for organising this. I am a deaf artist and have been for many, many years. I have been practicing art since before the advent of modern technology. And it was very difficult for a deaf artist to engage and connect with other artists without technology and what opportunities it has offered us today. And I've realised how important it is to offer opportunities for collaboration and networking, because before then we did face extreme barriers, and we still do when it comes to access, but things have come such a long way over time. I have seen a growth in the Deaf Artists Network. I have seen an increase in deaf identity and people feeling proud of their practice and their work as a deaf artist. I have seen collaborations take place globally. And that's all contributed to, that's all because of things becoming more accessible. Deaf artists are able to network and collaborate and communicate across continents and time zones, and it's really a beautiful thing to see. So that's been a wonderful positive and had a wonderful impact on the social arts movement. Previously, deaf artists, I guess you could say they were hidden. They would be practicing art for many years, but you wouldn't know about them. But then a network was formed. And that was devised by Arts Access Victoria, who were very productive in supporting deaf artists and bringing them together. And I guess supporting them to make a break into the mainstream scene. So that was one thing that happened. And that was really driven by Jodie Mundy, who herself has deaf parents. Her parents are deaf and her siblings are deaf. So she really lives and breathes deafness and Auslan. And she was so supportive of deaf artists and performers, along with Arts Access Victoria. And so they formed something called Deaf Arts Network. And it just, the scene of deaf artists exploded. All of a sudden, people coming out of the woodwork, deaf artists and performers we had never even heard of before. And then last year, Fringe Festival even employed a deaf person, that's Anna Seymour, to become part of the team, the production team. So you can see, just from the few examples I've given, how much it's come. I guess inclusivity has come such a long way, and we do feel we have more of an equal footing and we have more respect. At last year's Fringe Festival, there were 5 deaf performers, which is incredible. It's never been seen before. I guess really I want to touch on the deaf community Most deaf artists really practice and display or perform their work to the deaf community. It's very rare that they will actually present or exhibit or perform to the mainstream community. So I want to talk about a couple of deaf people, including Medina Straub. You may know her as Medina Sumovic. So there were three of us, including Bramis McRae, and we agreed that there needed to be some sort of deaf arts festival to celebrate the pride in our culture and our work, and to really enhance that notion of deaf space and raise the profile of deaf artists, and really encourage that deaf artist identity. And that identity comes in many different forms and it looks different. But the one thing that we have in common, or the theme that comes up the most, is a shared language, and that's Auslan, Australian Sign Language. And so we really wanted to celebrate that. And Flow Festival was established by three deaf people, so it was deaf-led. And we involved the deaf community. And it became a really collaborative event in terms of the build up, the process, the planning, and then the event itself. We held events like Deaf Slam, which is poetry. We had deaf children performing. We had deaf artists exhibiting their work. And in a first, we had a deaf Indigenous performance. And often, you know, there are deaf Indigenous performers, but we actually included them within the festival, and that was led by Patty Morris, who is from far North Queensland. She flew into Melbourne and delivered the most beautiful Dreamtime storytelling and exhibited art, and everybody was in absolute awe. And that had a huge impact, because that was another element of deafness that we as a community didn't really know much about. So that's going to become a fixture of future Flow festivals, because even within the deaf community, it's not one homogenous group. Everybody brings their own lived experience, their own practice, their own perspectives. And we were planning to have a second Flow festival this year, but unfortunately, especially with the travel restrictions, we've had to postpone it to next year. So it's still a very exciting time. We have now a team of, rather than three, a team of 11 people. So you can imagine the discussions are very robust and very imaginative. And we've received support from Creative Victoria and the Arts Council, and I'd like to acknowledge them. And we also have a really strong partnership with Northcote Town Hall in Melbourne, which is an arts centre. So that's a wonderful relationship we've been very fortunate to explore. And then, of course, Multicultural Arts Victoria. So you can see that the word is getting out there. People are starting to understand and recognise deaf arts. They're becoming more aware of us, which is fantastic. So, Riona speaking, it's lovely to be able to have a platform for us to share our work and our practice, but also create awareness amongst the mainstream arts community. So I'm just wondering, look, because I'm wondering if those who do not rely on Auslan or who are not deaf, if you wouldn't mind stopping your video, so the only people that appear on my screen are deaf people, and that way it's easy for me to, their videos, their screens will become bigger and I can easily read back their Auslan. That would be wonderful. And then we will, for those of you who turn your cameras off, you'll be hidden, so it makes everybody else's boxes bigger. Thank you. So I've talked about the success of Flow Festival, and that happens in Victoria, but I think, you know, with the more recognition of the mainstream, I think it has the potential to really grow and perhaps take place in other locations, especially as the team grows. We've now got 11 with lots more creative perspectives and ideas. So I've got a question for you, if, you know, or an offer for you, if you would like to collaborate with us or invite us to collaborate with you, please do so. And that includes if you were to ever host a workshop a webinar, a performance, to have a meeting place, if you could please consider having them captioned or interpreted. I know recently there was a meeting place that was interpreted, but there was no deaf representation within it. You know who we are now, you've met us, you've seen our faces, so please do ask us. And even if you go to Arts Access Victoria or Accessible Arts, we do have networks of deaf artists from all around the country, and we would love to work and collaborate with you. I would really love to see our industry help make their works or their resources more accessible. So there are professional captioners out there, so you can pay. If you were to use auto captions, it's not reliable. Often the words are omitted, or it's presented as jumble English. So there are actual professional captioning companies that you would need to pay, but will caption your resources or your events. And there are also qualified interpreters, even those who specialise in the arts or theatre, that can interpret your events. Auslan Stage Left is one go-to place where you can inquire about accessing interpreters. And it's really important because there is quite a huge supply and demand issue facing interpreters, that you try and book one well ahead of time rather than on the day or the day before. And I know funding is it is a barrier for people, but a trick here is when you are applying for funding to include access costs within your application rather than have it as an add-on after you've received the funding. Put that budget within your initial application. So it's really important that you think about access from get-go. And I would say allow 10% to 20% of your overall budget. That could average between 5,000 to 10,000. There are plenty of resources, information, if you would like to learn more about making your work more accessible. You just need to go to Arts Access Victoria, and they have so many resources. I'm trying to keep this to half an hour, so I am speeding through, but I'm really grateful that we were offered 45 minutes, but I'm happy to just take 30 minutes. I'm happy to have a Q&A. So if anyone would like to ask a question, please do go ahead. We've got one from Fiona. I'm just from Sydney. Sorry, I'm just...
Sorry, it wasn't, hi, Fiona here from Sydney Festival. It wasn't so much a question, but it was just to state that working closely with Accessible Arts has been invaluable to the Sydney Festival as an organisation over the years. And you know, it's been, everything that we've done really has been in collaboration with them. We set up a new disability programming initiative last year. We're just working on the second year of it now. And Accessible Arts has been really closely working with us on that one. And, you know, if we didn't have that relationship with them, we wouldn't even have started this particular initiative. So, you know, be close to those, whoever that organisation is in your state or territory.
Thanks, Fiona. Fiona's just started learning Auslan. I thought you all might like to know. Well done. It's very exciting. There's another question here from just from Michael. What do you think the experience would be to have a performance Auslan interpreted via Zoom, i.e. you could sit in the auditorium with the interpreter on screen? Bad idea? I think it's worthwhile exploring. I might ask Irene or Anna, who are both performers, to talk to that. Anna, would you like to answer that question? Okay. It's challenging. This is a challenging one. I have been asked this question often, and my answer is it's worthwhile asking a deaf person, which you have done. But it's worthwhile asking a deaf person to, before the show, create a promo video in Auslan, which can be distributed across social media channels. And deaf people often use Instagram and Facebook, for example. So it's good to ask them to promote the event that way. And Irene is saying, yes, I agree with that. It's better to really engage deaf artists and ask those deaf artists or an organisation like AAV or Deaf Arts Network to recommend a deaf artist, because they have the right contacts, they have the right channel, they know the right channels to promote events through. Because remember, our biggest barrier really is that if deaf people don't know the person that is promoting the event in Auslan, they won't take much notice. So it's important that the deaf community know and trust the person that is trying to convince them to attend an event, and then they will be more responsive. So it's important that it's a known face, and more often than not, that's someone who is from the deaf art scene themselves. So the next question is from Melissa from Arts Nexus. Peter, can you read that question? Oh no, that's okay, I've got it. What is the best method to contact the deaf community to let them know we do have interpretation? We usually go through deaf services, but that's not always guaranteed. I work with Tropical Arts Social Inclusive Theatre in Cairns that usually have deaf actors on stage with full interpretation. Someone's got their hand up. I think the best way to engage the deaf community is to contact Accessible Arts or through social media and Arts Essex Victoria, and just promote. Just in the search, type Auslan, and you will see a lot of perhaps groups or pages devoted to Auslan, the deaf community. So I would suggest really your first port of call should be any arts organisation that has a disability focus, or Arts Access Victoria or Accessible Arts. So that can help you with promoting your event, and they will, if they can't, then they will definitely know the best people too. And you said that you have tried to promote it through deaf services, but you didn't have much success. Look, let me think about how I want to answer this. Accessible Arts have resources. They have listings of different interpreting agencies from around the state. So perhaps you can look at that. Perhaps you could look at all the different interpreting services if the one you're being provided interpreters from are not supporting you with promotion. There's also a specialised there's also a company that specialises in theatre and performance interpreting, which is Auslan Stage Left, or you can always contact me directly. Okay, I think that's all of the questions from the chat. Does anyone else want to ask a question?
Michael Huxley has a question.
Oh, that's already been answered by Riona.
Fiona here again. I'd like to just add to the promotion thing. Something that we've done that seems to work well is to make sure that we have videos by whoever deaf consultant that we are using on those videos, and then we use those in our promotions. So they're obviously always on our website, but then we also put them on to, as Riona was saying, about like Facebook pages, deaf arts network pages on Facebook generally, and then as Irene was saying, also it's good to use people who the deaf community know and respect, and that's how we have managed to then kind of connect with the deaf community. It's really all about keeping them involved. I mean, it's not about Sydney Festival, it's all about the deaf community. That's why we're putting these shows on, interpreted. So yeah, it seems to have worked for us.
Thanks, Fiona. Irene wanted to add something. So Irene talking. Yes, it's very important. Last year at the Melbourne Fringe. Okay. Last year at Melbourne's Fringe Festival, it was an incredibly successful event because there was one deaf person working within the production team behind the scenes who knew how to share the relevant information, who had the networks to share it. And that in turn attracted not just more deaf artists to perform, but more to attend. And those who did perform attracted not just deaf audiences, but mainstream artists as well. There are also organisations like Auslan Consultancy, who are a deaf-led business, and they can produce Auslan translations of any video. That's their job. They have contracts with the Australian government and all sorts of organisations. So if you would like to promote your event, you can approach Auslan Consultancy to actually produce a very professional promotional video for you. Alternatively, if you decide you want to work with the deaf community more and collaborate with them, again, you might want to undertake deafness awareness training. So that will teach you the more appropriate communication protocols and how to engage and communicate with deaf people more appropriately. So that's another thing Auslan Consultancy and other deaf organisations can offer. And, you know, while you're at it, may as well learn Auslan. This is Riona speaking. Thank you, Irene. They're very useful tips. At Accessible Arts, I'll be finishing up very soon and setting up my own business. And it focuses on deaf training, deaf awareness training and deaf consultancy, and how to, you know, working on stage, your stagecraft. So I'm partnering with different organisations. So I'll be kind of like the bridge, that cultural bridge on how artists and organisations and audiences can work together. So that's something I'm very excited about. And that's when I referred to my Riona hat. And I must apologise to those people who are vision impaired. I forgot to describe who I am. I'm very sorry. So I have blonde, short, wavy hair. I'm approximately 40. I'm wearing a purple parka and a pink jumpsuit. And underneath that is a black shirt. I am smiling and I have a grey background behind me that's hiding a lot of mess surrounding me, and I do deeply apologise for forgetting to introduce myself visually. I'll just hand back to Irene. Unfortunately, I'm unable to keep up with the chat, but Maxine wants to ask a question in Auslan. So I don't know how we make that happen. There she is. Hello, Riona. I've not met you before. I'm from Victoria. Can you see me, Riona? Good. Thank you for so much today. I really enjoyed this discussion. I'm hearing myself, and I'm an Auslan interpreter, but I have been involved in the arts and theatre with different organisations. And one thing that I find as a barrier is that theatre organisations want to provide access, either using deaf or hearing interpreters, but then they'll provide interpreters, but few deaf people attend. and then that they're reluctant to provide access again. But I do explain the importance of building a relationship with the deaf community. Sometimes it might take even a few years, but from their perspective, it seems as though they're wasting money. But like Irene said earlier, deaf people will go if they feel they know and trust the organisation and are familiar with the people involved. So that takes time. So I'm just wondering, from your perspectives, the deaf perspectives, if you have any resources or anything you think that might support organisations to help them understand the importance of audience development. We don't want them to stop providing access. We want them to pursue it. So what tips do you have, or what resources can you offer? So this is Riona. You're right, Maxine, it takes time. It needs time to develop trust and a reputation. And it's really important that an organisation engages a deaf consultant or a deaf person to promote with the community. And it's not a failure if no one comes or just one or two people come. It's an opportunity to build and grow for next time, to build your audience. So I use the example of Fiona from the Sydney Festival, who, you know, now is using deaf faces in the promotional videos. And, you know, deaf people, they might not want to go alone. They'll want to go in a group of deaf people. It's very rare that deaf people want to go to an event alone, because who are they going to chat to? So the key there is looking for key deaf people who will bring people with them. So, for example, it's important to bring in key people from the community who represent different cohorts. For example, someone from the deaf queer community, someone who has a family, so they have different networks themselves, a deaf Indigenous person who has a whole complete different network. And even people who, it really, like Maxine said, it does take time. And deaf people do want to support your work and your practice. It's just about developing that relationship, that trust, and really creating everything, making everything accessible, not just the performance, but all the materials that help to promote your show as well. And I think really in this climate, COVID-19 has really highlighted some of the barriers that still exist. But aside from that, thank you, Maxine, for your question. Okay. Okay. I don't know if the rest of you, does anyone else have a question? Or Irene's just saying, Jody has posted a question in the chat about, if someone can read that. Peter, are you able to see that question in the chat?
I can read that question if you like.
Oh, great. Thank you, Elliot. Or, no, that wasn't Elliot.
What are your thoughts of the current controversy happening in the deaf community about hearing performer Andy Dexterity? The community believe he is culturally misappropriating the language and culture of deaf community. What can the arts industry learn about a protocol of the deaf community?
Sorry.
It's Peter.
So can you read out that question again, please? So Peter can sign it.
Okay. This is from Jody. What are your thoughts of the current controversy happening in the deaf community about hearing performer Andy Dexterity? The community believe he is culturally misappropriating the language and culture of the deaf community. What can the arts industry learn about the protocols of deaf community?
Okay. Oh, sorry. Can okay. So really, you need to have a deaf person involved, either as a consultant or a co-performer. And it's really important that if someone's going to represent the Auslan, the deaf community, deaf space, deaf identity, that they need to have that lived experience. It's very political at the moment. This is a very difficult situation that Jodie has raised. I have already, I have some information to share with you all. I was waiting for this question, so I had prepared for it. And it is really important that deaf people, we protect our language, our culture. We are happy to share, absolutely, but only for it to be lent and not misappropriated. I think it's really important that people who can hear respect our language and our identity and our culture. So when it's taken from us and used for financial gain, or sorry, for personal gain or professional gain, it's not very encouraging. I think people need to encourage deaf people to own this space and to share their language and culture because it's ours. I never gave permission. I think it needs to be a person who hasn't just learnt Auslan and then takes it and uses it in the way he has. This is a very complex situation, and I am hoping, look, I am going to give you a link to a Facebook post that explains it very clearly and succinctly about this very issue and about cultural misappropriation. Thank you for the question, Jodie. And now Irene is saying, it is a very sensitive issue. I think it's important that we develop positive relationships with the community, the mainstream community. But for many deaf people who grew up with Auslan as their first language, they don't see, Auslan is something to be really cherished. And it's very emotional when they see Auslan being used in the way it currently is outside of the community. Auslan is not just a language, it's a part of a person's cultural and identity and how they develop that identity. And then when they see hearing people using it in a way it's not supposed to be, so misappropriated, it's offensive, it can be emotional, and hearing people get opportunities using our language, whereas we don't necessarily always get those opportunities, isn't fair. I think if they had worked together with us and included us, it might be different. It's like you wouldn't misappropriate an Indigenous artist's culture or work. It's really, I think this all could have been avoided if deaf people were included from the start or collaborated with. But in a way, I'm trying to see the silver lining, but because it has made people question his intentions, and it has made people engage in conversation about culture and who owns the language and who should be using it. So that's a positive to come out of this. People are having robust discussions. Riona is saying you raise a valid point, Irene. I wish we had endless hours to continue this discussion today, but hopefully it can take place in other forums. In wrapping up, I would love to thank Little Lunches Online for giving us this opportunity to share our work and our language and our culture. I would like to thank you all for attending today and supporting us, and we look forward to future collaborations. Thank you. Come to Flow Festival. Goodbye.